panel on national trends in redistricting. And I'm going to introduce and let them tell a little bit about themselves, our three panelists today, beginning with Dr. Jonathan Winburn.
Hi, I'm a professor of political science at the University of Mississippi, and I'm glad to see Oxford's not the only place that's shut down for a week because of some cold weather. So, so I'm in the Department of Political Science. A lot of my research focuses on redistricting, and I'm happy to sort of talk about some of the stuff going on in the nation today.
And Dr. Brian Marks.
Good day, everybody. My name is Dr. Brian Marks. I'm an assistant professor of geography in the Department of Geography and Anthropology here at Louisiana State University. Most of my professional research is about the Louisiana shrimp business and the globalization of the seafood business. I teach an upper division course, cross-listed with political science, about political geography, about a third of which is devoted to specifically redistricting and a lot of other things related to that. So this is an interesting subject and one that I'm glad to be speaking to a larger audience than my normal 20 to 25 undergrads.
Thank you. And to my right, Michael Lee.
Hi everyone, I'm Michael Lee. I head the redistricting project at the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law in New York. We are a think tank attached to the law school, and in addition we do a lot of advocacy work in the states and also participate in litigation around the country around the subject of litigation, around the subject of redistricting and voting rights. It's good to be back in Louisiana. I am a graduate of Tulane Law Schools, so I always love coming back down here, although I don't remember ever being quite this cold when I was in law school, but first time for everything. So.
Thank you. You're brave to say Tulane in this audience, but we appreciate you being here today. There we go. So we're going to start with Dr. Marks. We're going to let each of the panelists make their presentation. They do have some slides to kind of go through their presentation, and we're going to wrap up kind of on the national jurisdiction and courts scene, and then we'll open it up. I'm sure we're going to have a lot of questions at the end. So, Dr. Marks.
Thanks. Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you. Some of the things that were very ably said by Mr. Robert Travis Scott and the representatives and senators here, I will reiterate. I will try not to overlap the other things that the other panelists are going to say and sort of steal their thunder. I'd like to say basically three things. One is I'd like to speak about the social science of redistricting and gerrymandering, what is understood in the political science and the other social sciences about this subject, which would be relevant for the future of redistricting here in Louisiana. I'd like to say a little bit about the things that a redistricting commission, should one come into existence in the state of Louisiana, or the legislature heading towards 2021, will have to make decisions about that bear upon redistricting that aren't directly actually drawing the lines. And I'll try not to get too far afield with that. The last point is I'd like to say a few things about Louisiana and its current times and its history in terms of race and partisanship and redistricting. So start with, anybody who's going to be doing redistricting does have to in fact make a number of decisions, and not to go to law school with all of you here. As I tell all my political science, political geography students, the question of who are we the people is one of the things that you are always deciding when you're making these sorts of decisions. For federal decisions, the U.S. House of Representatives, you don't really have much choice. You've got to take the U.S. Census numbers. Now, it's very concerning what's going on to possibly basically break the U.S. Census for 2020. Hopefully that doesn't happen. But the state, for legislative seats in the state House and the state Senate, does have a certain degree of flexibility, as do other states. Is the state going to measure the people to add up them to draw equal population districts for the PSC and for the state Senate and the state House and everything else? Are they going to include U.S. citizens that aren't permanent residents of the state? There is, as I understand it, I have an extremely capable lawyer to my right who can say line and verse about this. You have some potential change in that. You have some potential change in terms of citizens of Louisiana, citizens of the United States that aren't registered voters. Are you going to count all of them? And are you going to include non-U.S. citizens, whether they're here legally or not? For the U.S. House, you've got to include everybody. until the federal law changes. But for the state, it isn't necessarily so. That's a real decision that the state has to make. And if it doesn't make a decision, it continues with what it's done before. And that is also making a choice. The second point, I'm not going to talk about felon disenfranchisement, who actually has the right to vote. Again, I'm going to try to keep this narrow. But you do have to make a decision about, what about people in prison that are U.S. citizens? They get counted by the census. But what is their political status, especially in a state like Louisiana, where they can't vote while they're in jail? They can't vote when they come out of jail as long as they're on parole or probation. For the people in prison, you do have a choice, and I believe it was Representative Smith who spoke to us earlier. I believe she tried to pass a bill a few months or years ago about this issue. Are we going to count those people where they're sitting in Hunt or in Dixon or in Angola or in a parish jail? Or are we going to count them at their last mailing address when they went to prison? That makes a big difference, for example, in terms of the urban, large concentrations of population in the state versus places like West Feliciana, where there ain't many people, and a lot of them are in Angola. West Feliciana, if you count all those people, has a lot more representation than it otherwise would for people who cannot vote. So that's a real decision that the state does have a certain ability to change. Third, it's called prison gerrymandering, by the way. Look it up on the internet. You have to decide to what extent you're going to really try to strictly abide by what's left of the Voting Rights Act, Section 2, and what extent you're going to really insist upon population equality. There's a little bit of wiggle room on some of those issues. You can try to slavishly, we're going to do everything to satisfy the Justice Department. You can say, maybe we'll risk a lawsuit. We heard earlier, people were apparently really trying to please Eric Holder in 2011 in the state legislature. And finally, you have to decide what kind of districts the state legislature and possibly in the future some kind of commission is going to have jurisdiction over. Right now, the state legislature doesn't draw the parish council lines. It doesn't draw school board lines. It doesn't draw metro council lines here in Baton Rouge. Those bodies basically draw their own lines. You could conceivably take that power. That's an interesting question. I don't know what the right answer is to that. And also, which was mentioned by Robert Travis Scott as well, judicial districts. How strictly are you going to deal with questions, for example, of malapportionment? You have equal numbers of people for the judicial bodies. Because the Supreme Court ain't going to save you. Because the Supreme Court says, we don't really do much about judicial districts. So you can have gross inequality of population between judicial districts. And you can do a lot of things that, like just happened where I'm from Terrebonne Parish. The Terrebonne Parish NAACP just basically swept the floor with the Louisiana Attorney General's office, which is appealing, which is, we can talk about that.
Another panel.
For another panel. Well, actually it is this panel. I mean...
you get a couple minutes on that one.
Sure. Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act is still alive, and the Terrebonne NAACP just beat the state of Louisiana about redistricting for a majority-minority judicial district in the judicial district down there in Terrebonne Parish. So we, either by keeping the status quo or changing things or having a commission or not having a commission, these are the things that are really relevant. And I'm not talking about what the Congress can do. Can the Congress reauthorize the Voting Rights Act, Section 5? That is definitely for another panel. But these are things that the state legislature or a commission really does need to think about and really has to make a decision. And if they don't make a decision in a sort of French existentialist sort of way, you've still made a decision by not doing anything about it. A little bit on the social science. So again, that's the first topic. The second topic, social science. Oftentimes when we look at redistricting and gerrymandering, everybody has a certain sense of it's bad and we don't like it, but we don't necessarily as the public get what it's about. When you show one of these really crazy districts that looks like a piece of origami or some weird abstract fractal design or something, and people say that ain't right. Well, my point here is the political scientists and sociologists and geographers and so forth of the world have something better than what I would call modern art appreciation. It's not like looking at a Jackson Pollock abstract painting and trying to figure out what it means. That's mostly where we get at this stuff, but that's not as precise as we can get. We can get a lot better than that. And it is important to understand that not every measure of what do we mean by gerrymandering means the same thing. Certain types of gerrymandering have certain metrics, and they're not all the same. So what do I mean? Well, very briefly, we have things like contiguity, which just means the district has to actually touch all the other parts of it. We have some strange congressional districts and strange House and Senate districts in the state. Steve Scalise's district, you got to swim across Lake Pontchartrain to get to parts of it. You got to swim across Lake Bourne to get to other parts of it from others, et cetera, et cetera. You got to swim across Lake Maurepas to get to some parts of Garrett Graves' district from the main part of it. Compactness. This is usually what people define as the circumstantial evidence. That district looks really weird. Why did they draw a crazy looking funky shape? Compactness is a statistical measure. A perfect circle is considered perfectly compact. And so you can draw up a number. You have every single congressional district, you have a score for how compact that district is. That is usually good circumstantial evidence for something ain't right. But it is usually not enough to therefore say there's racial or partisan or whatever gerrymander. You can have a really funky shape that is a very quote-unquote fair district from these other criteria. So it's good to think about, but you need to go a little further too. Responsiveness and competitiveness. Competitiveness is pretty simple. This is this notion of, I got a 50-50 chance of the Democrat or the Republican winning the race. And that one is often what people think about when they say, it ain't fair, you've basically gerrymandered this district so only Republicans or only Democrats can win. Responsiveness is also a really important category, and that is this idea of if the voters shift, if we have a 2010 Tea Party landslide, or we're saying now there's going to be maybe a 2018 Democratic wave, if the voters shift 5 or 10 points left or right, do the seats that are won shift along with them? If you have no responsiveness, the politician can say, too bad, we don't care how you vote, we don't care if you shifted 5 or 10 points, we're the same people, because we gerrymandered you in such a way you can't really shift us out of office. The measures that are being put before the Supreme Court, the United States Supreme Court and other courts around the country, are things like partisan symmetry and the efficiency gap. And not to get very long and deep into that, these are measures that basically ask, if you get the same percentage of votes for your party, the Democrats, the Republicans, whoever, do I get a proportionality of seats relative to my statewide or nationwide or whatever vote? There are particular social sciencey, technical, wonky things that I won't get into right now about how these work, but they do address these sorts of things that were mentioned by several panelists earlier about these notions of things like wasted votes, which is to say, all the votes that get cast for a political party that don't result in a seat being won, that's all wasted votes from this definition. And every vote that's cast for you above 50% plus 1 for you to get the seat, that's also a wasted vote. And you can measure through that's an efficiency gap measure. And when you count up those votes, what you get a sense of is, for example, are people being quote unquote packed? When I say packing, I mean you've stuffed way more people than necessary to get 50% plus 1. That could be on the basis of race, that could be the basis of partisanship, whatever. If you're a 90% African American, 90% Democratic district, or vice versa, 90% white, 90% Republican, you don't have a lot of efficiency in that vote being cast. There's 40% of the people that cast their vote, and you already won. You're just winning and winning and winning and winning extra. And if you redistributed those voters elsewhere, you'd have more competitive races in the other districts. So that's the kind of stuff that we're talking about. When we say a partisan gerrymander or a bipartisan gerrymander or a racial gerrymander, sometimes it's the same thing, sometimes it isn't. But very briefly about those questions. A partisan gerrymander is when a political party or a faction of a political party draws the lines, usually to crack strong bases of support for their opponents, and then pack into a small number of districts their opponents. So yeah, you're going to pick up a few seats. We can't completely suppress your vote, but you're going to have a whole bunch of wasted votes. A bipartisan gerrymander is slightly different. We usually get these in legislatures that have divided government, because the governor has a veto pen, and the House or the Senate, if they're run by different parties, can't agree. And we tend to get very different looking gerrymanders. They're both for partisan purposes, but a bipartisan gerrymander tends to look like an incumbency protection gerrymander, which is what you think about commonsensically would happen. I scratch your back, you scratch mine. I can't knock you out of office, you can't knock me out of office. So we're going to protect all of our senior people. So you tend to get more of a winner-take-all situation when one party rules governorship, state house, state senate. We had a lot of those after 2010 in the last redistricting cycle around this country. Some Democratic states, majority of the states that had this were Republican-controlled states. And we had some bipartisan gerrymanders. So they're two different kinds of bad things. I'll say very briefly about communities of interest and political boundaries. Sometimes those get construed to be the same thing. They're not. Communities of interest is actually one of these subjective Jackson Pollock painting, what do you think it is, I don't know, kind of things. And I appreciate that everybody's got an opinion about it, and it can be very important. Nonetheless, I'm still really skeptical about using communities of interest as a strong plank for some sort of reformed redistricting, here or anywhere else. I'll tell you the same story I like to tell my undergraduates when we talk about regionalization in geography. I'm from Terrebonne Parish. I'm from Bayou du Large, south of home. That's where I'm from. And around there, one of the arguments that you invariably get into around Thanksgiving and Christmas is about gumbo and how you ought to make it. And so we get in these silly things about these people are Catholics and these people are Baptists and these people eat this and these other people don't. And of course, Louisiana is really this amazing cultural melange of all gumbo of all these different elements. It's true. They're right. And my being from Terrebonne Parish, I have very strong feelings about, for example, whether potato salad ought to be in gumbo, and whether it ought to be in the gumbo or served on the side of the gumbo, and other things like that. People get very heated about this kind of stuff. So we got communities of interest about our cultural differences, okay, between Terrebonne and Lafourche, and one bayou versus another, and all this kind of stuff. But I just want to say, like, let's get a little bit real about politics versus that stuff. Now, black people and white people in Louisiana mostly eat the same food, which is mostly, frankly, African-originated stuff, even though white people probably don't like to admit it. We tend to watch the same Saints games, do the same things, but we have radically, racially polarized electoral behavior. I don't like it. I didn't create it. You didn't create it either. You want to blame somebody? It's Iberville and Bienville who introduced the evil of black slavery in Louisiana in 1719. We're celebrating them right now in New Orleans. That's who started it. It wasn't me, it wasn't you. But we should be a little grown up, I think, about saying, well, we got a community of interest. This guy don't know about what's going on in this next parish. To a certain extent, that's true, but when we get down to, should the state expand Medicaid or should it not? Should we have criminal justice reform? Who should go to prison? Who should? Should we raise the taxes? Should we lower the taxes? Who should be running the state? I don't have to like it. I can decry it. But right now, this state, along with Mississippi and Alabama, we do share that with them, are the most racially polarized political places among the 50 states of America. And if we're going to change each other's hearts and do that, that's going to take a lot of work. Redistricting ain't going to fix it. But redistricting is one of the things we as a broken society try to do to keep ourselves back together again. So I'm not trying to depress you about anything about that, but I think communities of interest, we need to be a little bit more real and say, no, actually, another thing at Thanksgiving and so forth, you get to meet your relatives and they drink a few beers. And a lot of people may deny that, we don't have racism like we used to. Well, y'all need to meet my relatives at Thanksgiving and Christmas and Easter Sunday, because I got some racist relatives. I got a lot of them. So I think we say this and we talk very nice and we had silly things about culture and so forth. That's not necessarily actually our political behavior. It really is a lot about race, and race overlaps so much with partisanship. Because this ain't California. If we were in California, we'd have a different conversation. So, how am I doing?
I need to move on to the next one, let you come back and jump in a few minutes.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, Dr. Lindbergh.
Okay, let me get this pulled up. It'll take me.
Okay. So while he's pulling that up, I want to ask a question, Dr. Marks. When we come upon a time like we're coming on right now, where we're in the first term of the new president, saw the political switch in the White House, and we're at the midterm election. What is the historical trend? Because all the pundits have a theory of what's going to happen. We all have recent memory of what's going to happen, probably since we've been voting, where the congressional elections will or won't swing. what is historically, briefly,
Sure.
you know, what do we see to expect, and are the pundits correct in this?
You ask a college professor to be brief, especially me, it's a problem. But, and I'm not a pollster, okay? I'm not one of those people. But yeah, the obvious thing is, you know, the president comes in, people, you know, get what they thought they were getting or get what they didn't think they were getting, and they don't like it. Huey Long said, one of these days, people in Louisiana are going to get good government, they're not going to like it. So,
That's true.
obviously, you know, I'm not going to talk about the president, but typically it swings the other way in the midterm. It happens pretty regularly.
And so we're coming up, and so in this generation, we're coming up on the census as well, which of course that is, I think, added to the, I think it's added to the hype in the national discussion of kind of where we're going, not just with the 18 elections, but what that's going to look like as we go forward. So we probably can come back to this 2 or 3 times
Okay.
in our panel. So
Do you want me to answer?
Yeah, real quick, yeah.
Okay. It makes a difference. The Congress makes a difference for everything the Congress can do. But right before the 2011-2012 redistricting cycle, there was, hey, a Republican wave, which was in part consciously pushed forward to take over state legislatures and governorships to be able to redraw the maps for 2012 through 2021, which does in part buffer the Republican majority in the House from a Democratic wave. So the 2011 gerrymander, which did overall nationwide benefit the Republican Party in the US House, is going to be somewhat less strong than it otherwise would have been because of gerrymander. But that, I mean, that doesn't therefore mean a huge wave won't break that.
Thank you. Dr. Wells, thanks.
All right, thank you. So I know, you know, part of this when everyone talks about redistricting is potential ideas for reform. And I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about the use of commissions throughout the country, because that has typically been when I think people think about redistricting reform, commissions often come to mind. So I'm just going to spend a little bit of time talking about how these are set up around the country, and then we can come back at the end and sort of talk about pros and cons if we get to that, if we want to. But you know, as the legislators on the panel before us basically said, this should be a legislative process. So this is legislative redistricting reform often has to come from the outside of the legislature because legislators don't want to give up their control over the process. And that makes sense. And like I said, there are some, I could make some arguments for legislative control over redistricting other than being better than a commission control or whatever. But most states still use the legislature for this process, and it's treated as sort of normal business, which means it is introduced as, you know, legislation. It goes through the regular legislative process. The governor has a veto power. In most states, there's a handful of states where the governor does not have a veto over the plans. And I'm going to talk both about what happens at the congressional level and at the state legislative level, because the states often will handle this a little bit differently. But right now, there are 36 states that still use the legislature for handling redistricting, and there's 43 states that still use legislative redistricting, legislative redistricting for their congressional maps. So that leaves, you know, especially on the legislative side, some states that use commissions in a variety of formats, and I'm going to spend some time talking about those. Now, let me mention real fast is that in most of the rest of the world that does redistricting, it's not a big deal like it is in America. In most other countries that have this redistricting process or a version of it, it's usually some sort of bureaucratic or judicial function, and it doesn't have the same sort of political controversy usually that's associated with us here. Just wanted to mention that before I turn to the states. Let me start by showing you which states use a commission in some variety, and this is all from the NCSL, the National Conference of State Legislatures. So this is for Congress. The states in, it's sort of my ode to LSU, and I couldn't really bring myself to putting gold in here. That's supposed to be purple. You see the states around the country that use commissions. Now, I'm going to talk about how the format of these commissions in just a minute, but in some fashion, these are the states that use a commission for the congressional plans. You notice in southern states, very little commission use at the congressional level. Most of the states tend to be out west. There's a handful of Midwestern sort of New England states Mid-Atlantic states as well. And part of this is states that have a stronger initiative process have been the ones that have often had an easier time getting commissions passed in some form. And that's one reason why you don't see as much use in the South. At the legislative level, you do see a broader use of commissions in some ways. Mississippi has a commission that's very rarely used on the legislative side. Arkansas, for their state legislative plans, their commission has a primary responsibility for the process. Texas and Oklahoma, sort of the states surrounding Louisiana, at least on the legislative side, do use commissions or have commissions on the books in some form. All right, so sort of see how it's spread out around the country. But when really thinking about these commissions, I think there's a couple of things to think about. One is their role in the process, because they're not all created the same. This is at the congressional level. Basically, commissions can come in 3 forms. And then I have Iowa, it's its own special case, which I'll talk a little bit about. The commission can have the primary responsibility. So the drawing of legislative maps does not go through the legislature at all. And you see the states here for Congress, mostly western states, led by California and Arizona most notably, have these states at the congressional level with primary responsibility. There are states, the states in yellow here are the advisory states, where they have a commission that in some capacity advises the legislature in drawing the maps. And the role of these advisory commissions, or how seriously they're taken varies from state to state. And then you have Indiana there and Connecticut with a backup commission on the congressional level, so they get involved if the legislature fails to implement the maps within a certain time period. At the state level, same format. You see all of the commissions surrounding Louisiana at the state level, except for Arkansas, are backup commissions. In Mississippi, it's very rarely used. In Texas, it has been used in the past. Like I said, Arkansas has a primary role in this as well. Like I said, in Iowa, it's its own special case, which I'll come back to in just a minute. So you see some other states here with some primary use at the legislative level that is not at the congressional level. Most notably Ohio, Pennsylvania, New Jersey. You've still got your western states, Washington, Idaho, California, and Arizona here. All right, so usually the role is not that controversial in terms of when they get involved. Occasionally you will see the legislature purposely delaying or not getting it done to get the process to a commission. This has happened in Texas before because the legislators thought the commission would be more favorable in the outcome that the majority in the state legislature wanted. So occasionally you will see some sort of politics there and trying to, have the legislature purposely not finish the maps to get it to a backup commission or something like that. But I don't think there's usually a ton of controversy here in the role they play. The other aspect, though, is the appointment method. So who's actually on the commission? And here I've got it broken down into 4 different groups. On the congressional side, I'll show you here, then I'll show it on the state legislative side as well, spend a little bit more time on it. But so basically got what I'm calling bipartisan, and let me note here when I say bipartisan, I'm not suggesting that's actually how they function. It's just that their appointment method is in a way that there's either an equal number of Democrats and Republicans appointed, and in a lot of cases, those commissioners will then pick a tie-breaking member. So it's supposed to be sort of an equal number from both parties on there. The independent and citizen commissions here that you see in California and Arizona, and I've also put Virginia in this category. It's a new commission. The governor just created it with an executive order as an advisory board or advisory commission. These are the ones that have taken the process sort of most directly out of the politicians' hands, and I'll talk a little bit more about those in just a second. Partisan here, which you'll see a lot more on the state legislative appointment map. This is where if you look at who's on these commissions, there's clearly one party can have a majority of the members. So that's what happened in Texas. I believe it was in the 1990s redistricting. The Republicans, I think there may have still been some Democratic control somewhere in the state at the time, but the Republicans knew if they could delay getting the plan to the backup commission, that they had a clear majority on that commission, which is what they did. Arkansas's commission is made up of basically like the governor, the secretary of state, I think one other state office. So these states in red here are ones, if you look at the breakdown of the membership, it's clearly one party is going to have a majority on the commission. So I'm considering those partisan commissions. But one thing most people are sort of interested in at the moment is, what about sort of California and Arizona, these states that have moved to what I'm calling here these independent or citizen commissions? And we talk a little bit about those. In Arizona, it's considered an independent commission, but there's still, I think there's probably more politics involved in that process in terms of the appointments. Basically, the way that works is a court selects 10 Republican names, 10 Democratic names, and 5 individuals that are registered as independents from a pool of applicants. They then send those names for potential commissioners to the state parties. The party leaders pick, so the Democrats get to pick 2 names from that list of 10 Democrats, the Republicans 2 names from that list of Republicans, and then those 4 commissioners choose one of the independent members. And it was actually a hugely controversial round in 2010 in Arizona on this, the way the commission worked. So it is independent, but the party leaders are still involved in this process. California is more of a, I guess what I'm calling a true citizen commission, where individuals apply in, they go through some long application process, and they are selected with very little sort of party involvement in that selection process in California. So this is sort of the differing ways commissions are set up around the country in these differing formats. And I'll stop there for right now. Just want to sort of introduce what they look like, and then at the end we may come back to sort of, you know, pros and cons of these different formats and what they mean.
Great, thank you so much. And Michael Lee.
Sure. So I will start off by saying I have never heard of putting potato salad in gumbo, but I'm not adverse to trying it. But that
You need to try.
Yeah, it didn't seem like something that, you know, 2 things that don't go together. It's like putting watermelon in gumbo.
I'll need to plug this in.
So anyway, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the national landscape, and this really is an extraordinary moment for redistricting reform. In doing this work, I've never seen as much energy as there has been in the past couple of years, and in particular the last year and going into this year. All around the country, there are extraordinary grassroots efforts ongoing to reform the redistricting process. In Michigan, there is a ballot initiative that was totally volunteer-led. It began with a single Facebook post, and it ended up being a movement that collected over 500,000 signatures to put this on the ballot, which, if you've ever done ballot initiatives, is extraordinary, because the traditional thinking goes you have to go out and hire some people to go knock doors and canvass. You know, Michigan's cold in the winter, and you have to have some paid component of it. This is totally volunteer, and if you talk to the volunteers there, or in a state like Ohio, they say they go down the street in their very mixed partisan neighborhoods where it's a Democratic house next to a Republican house, and everybody signs. And that really, you know, shows how much people are fed up with the dysfunction in the country, in the sense that redistricting has something to do with that. And that's borne out by polling, which tells us that 74% of Americans say that politicians shouldn't be the ones that draw lines that benefit themselves. And that includes 74% of Republicans and 73% of Democrats. And so it's a bipartisan support for this. The other reason that this is an extraordinary moment is that we're coming up, the discussion about redistricting reform is taking place in an environment where there is both legal risk that didn't exist before, and there's political risk. And the legal risk comes from the courts. The courts have never clearly put partisan gerrymandering out of bounds in the way that they have put racial gerrymandering or discriminating on the basis of race out of bounds, and that's led to some real anomalies this decade, particularly in the South, where Republican lawmakers have insisted that no, we weren't trying to discriminate against African Americans or Latinos. We were just trying to discriminate against Democrats, and lo and behold, they just happen to be African American and Latino. But the feeling is you can get away with whatever you want as long as you can put a political label on it. That may be coming to an end with some of the cases that are moving through the Supreme Court. There are currently 2, and there may be a third that gets heard this term, that will take up the issue of whether there are boundaries on partisan gerrymandering. And so going into 2020, if the court does put some boundaries, people will know that if they draw a bad map or even a map that's subject to debate, they will get sued and they will have to undergo depositions and they will have to turn over emails and do all kinds of things like that. So that's some legal risk for lawmakers, even in states where you don't have a ballot initiative. And then you also have political risk, right? Because the way that you do these sort of seat maximizing gerrymanders, and they don't occur everywhere, but the way that you sort of grab, the way that you create like a 10-3 GOP balance in a state like North Carolina is, you don't draw districts that your party wins by 80% if you're the gerrymandering party. You draw districts that you want to spread your voters out as much as possible to win as many seats as possible. So you draw 53, 54, 52% districts. The danger is that if you do that, and even if you do it well, you may be protecting yourself against a 100-year flood or even a 200-year flood, but what happens if there's a 500-year flood or a tsunami? And if you're a Republican gerrymander in some of these states and you're looking at 2018 and 2020, there are a lot of signs at least that it could be a tsunami, which just take a look at Virginia. There's a map that was designed to lock in a Republican advantage in the House of Delegates, and Democrats came within 1 seat of taking control in the most recent election in a tsunami wave election. And so you're facing both legal risk and political risk. So there's a tremendous amount of energy around redistricting reform, and it is bipartisan. John Kasich has called gerrymandering the worst problem we have. In the cases that were at the Supreme Court, a huge number of Republicans and Democrats joined together in briefs to say, please help us put some limits on this problem. So there's good news on that front. The bad news is that whatever the court does is not likely to solve the problem in and of itself, just because of the nature of how judicial decisions work. And so there do need to be state level reforms. The good news there is that there are a lot of ways to do this. As John talked about, there are different models, and we have done a lot of research at the Brennan Center about this. Some suggestions that we would have, the number one thing that you can do in reforming the process, whether or not you create a commission, is to create a process where one party doesn't control all the levers of power, right? The worst gerrymanders occur when one party has all of the marbles. If you simply create a structure where there's more balance, and you could do that on a commission, like in California, you have 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, and 4 independents, and to approve a map, each bucket has to separately approve, so Democrats and independents can't team up to screw Republicans or vice versa or any other combination. That helps a lot. Some states have imposed a supermajority requirement, which means at least getting some members of the minority party to buy in before a plan is approved. That also can help produce better and fairer maps. So the number one thing that you can do is to sort of to make sure that one party doesn't have control of all of the marbles. Now, if you are going to design a commission, we would highly recommend that you have an independent selection process. And lots of people resist this, lawmakers in particular resist this, because they say, how can you give power to ordinary people? We know way more than these people know. And California is a great example of why that if you do it right, it doesn't have to be that way. Now, California has a very rigorous screening process. You have to write 5 essays and go for a 90-minute in-person interview before 3 auditors. So it's like going to grad school, essentially, and maybe worse than going to grad school. All of this is live streamed on public television in California. It's archived to this day. You can watch the interviews. And what happens then is a list is produced, and lawmakers get to strike people off just like a jury, but they don't get to pick. And then there's a random selection for 8 people, and then the 8 pick the remaining 6 to balance out for diversity, geographic and otherwise, because if you have a random draw, all 8 could come from Los Angeles County and nobody could come from the northern part of the state, and so you use the remaining 6 to balance it out. That seems to be a process that works really well. The idea is, what we have found is that ordinary citizens absolutely take this job very seriously. What people have told us, including map drawers and political operatives, have said, those guys came in and they really didn't have a political agenda. We always, we kind of have an end where we want to get when we're doing it as lawmakers, and we figure out how to pretextually justify the end that we want to get to. These guys really came in and they didn't have that, and they performed very much like a jury. They weighed the evidence. They had 70 hearings around the state and took evidence. So that's one thing we would say. The other thing is that you need clear, prioritized rules. One of the problems with redistricting right now is the rules aren't very clear. The criteria that you have are vague and they're not prioritized, and sometimes you can't do all of the things that you're supposed to do, like keep counties whole, but also have competitive districts or compact districts or something like that. And it just sort of, you need map drawers, especially if you have a commission, need guidance as to like, this is the number one thing, this is the number two thing, do these in this order. And if you give them that, they do really well. We also recommend a commission of about 9 to 15 members. 9 to 15 members seems like a really great commission size. Anything smaller, and we heard about the Arizona Commission, which has had some controversy. Arizona has 5 members. And so 5 members on a commission like Arizona's, it's hard to represent a state fully in terms of its diversity with only 5 members, even a relatively small state like Arizona. But that also means that any one member of the commission has an outsized vote, right? I mean, a rogue actor or somebody who's in the pocket of somebody has a huge say. If you have, say, a 15-member commission, you have less concern about a rogue actor. You also have greater diversity, so that can be really important. Another thing that we would say in designing commission is that you should incentivize compromise, right? This is not a process where you have simple majority rules. I talked about California, where each bucket has to approve Democrats, Independents, and Republicans. And by the way, putting independents on the commission is like an innovation that came from California. It's been followed since in almost every state that has tried to do this, because it's it was an aha moment. Like, independents are actually a big group, and they should have a voice. But the California model of having each bucket approved incentivizes compromise, because you know that you have to actually get to a point where people, you get the requisite approval, and you need support from everybody everybody who's at the table, at least in some measure. And so that incentivizes compromise. The other thing that helps is actually imposing like a fairly significant cost to this, right? Because sometimes, as we've heard today, deadlock is a strategy, right? If you sometimes you think, aha, we'll deadlock, and it'll go to this backup commission that we like, or it'll go to it'll go someplace else, and so that can be a strong incentive, like throwing it to the courts or having some kind of randomized process where you really don't know what happens, incentivizes people to actually produce a good result. The last thing I will say on this is that there should be strong transparency requirements. This is a process that people feel distrustful about because it is not a very transparent process. California goes out of its way to be transparent. Everything is broadcast on TV live as it occurs. Everything has to occur in the meetings, other than meetings with legal counsel. And you can watch it, it's archived, it really does sort of help foster it, and it actually does help produce responsiveness, because you would get people who testified in California and say, I want to do X, Y, Z, but somebody would email and say, that person really is the brother-in-law's representative so-and-so, and they're just doing this on his behalf, and the commission would say, aha, and so that actually does help. That's an easy thing to do, regardless of whether you create a commission or leave it in the hands of the legislature. If you choose to leave it in the hands of the legislature, there is a third model which was alluded to earlier, which is an advisory commission, which is have a commission draw maps. Usually the way that works is the legislature gets an up or down vote on that. In Washington State, the legislature can tweak the districts, but they can't move more than a certain amount of the population. That can be a happy middle ground, because sometimes lawmakers feel like the commission might get something wrong, but just on the margins, but they can't wholesale throw out what the commission did, and that is a model that can sort of perhaps balance some of the competing tensions. So with that, I will leave it.
Thank you so much. I'm struck by that last example and thinking about, as we were talking and listening in the earlier panel about Congressman Richmond's district, and having sat through the meetings for my home, Lake Charles, in the 3rd district a few years ago, how disparate even our opinions are, not necessarily black-white, Democrat-Republican, but north and south in Louisiana. We think about our redistricting in such a different way, coming originally from the central part of the state, now living in the southern part of the state. vastly different how we even approach things. So with that little note, I'll throw it back to you, Dr. Marks. I know you had a couple points you wanted to come back to, and I think we're back up.
I hope so. I think it died.
So we have there.
Well, maybe we'll have a computer, maybe we won't.
Sorry, guys.
It's okay. I think it's coming back on if somebody wants to. I don't like doing computer repairs while I'm live here, so if it
We've got
turns
about-
on, it'll turn on.
We've got about 10 minutes.
Sure.
And
I'll be-
I'll open up for some questions.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, why don't you let one of the others do a little more while I try to get this work, because I wanted to show
Very
some
good.
things.
So
Okay.
I can say something.
Sure, go ahead.
I can just respond on communities of interest. That is oftentimes something that people feel is very broad, because what the heck is a community of interest? And it is true that people will claim almost anything is a community of interest. And in many states, people will go there and say, my community of interest is that I'm represented by Jane Smith, and we are the people, the community who loves Representative Jane Smith. So, you know, you get everything. But as it turns out, if you give it to a commission and they're taking it seriously, they'll weigh the evidence and they'll reach a conclusion. You may disagree with the conclusion, but it will tend to be, in experience, at least in the commissions that we studied, be something that everyone feels like, okay, that was a reasonable choice from among the range of reasonable choices that exist. And so a great example in California, just very quickly, there are communities in the mountains in Los Angeles County who insisted that they should be joined together in a legislative district. And you know, if you know anything about the mountains, you really can't drive across the mountains. You drive into the valley, and then you can go to the other parts of the mountain like driving around. But so it's not really a logical community in many ways. Their mountain valley districts are more logical, but they insisted they wanted a single district because they had one big concern that they didn't feel was getting represented in Sacramento, and that is fires. And they wanted somebody who would care about preventing and giving them the resources they needed to fight wildfires. And they went and they put together big presentations and they testified, and the commission drew a district that went that way, and it actually sort of makes a lot of sense, even though these districts in many ways aren't logical otherwise. Some are very rich and some are just middle class, some are Republican, some are Democratic, but they said, we really care about this, and that's an example of how if you allow testimony, if you allow transparency, it can result in a good result.
Well, I was gonna, basically, Michael just stole my example of the communities of interest in California and how it worked with the commission last time. And I would also add, I mentioned Iowa a little bit, and let me throw out something about it. Iowa is similar to like what Michael mentioned with Washington State, is they're the sort of a sort of perhaps model that legislators may be more conducive to, instead of outright taking it completely out of their hands, is letting the legislative staff handle the drawing of the maps and then letting the legislators have some say over the, choosing a map or voting up or down. And that seems to work really well in Iowa. Iowa's a little unique in that all the counties are nice and square and it's very homogeneous and not a large, big urban center. But that model, I think, is also one that's perhaps workable if you're in a state where the likelihood of getting taking completely out of the legislators' hands is not going to happen, but you want to try to have still, some other process in place where it's not just completely the people that are going to benefit from the district getting to draw their own districts. So.
Dr. Marks, final thoughts? No.
Sure. The visuals would help, but I'll just be very brief. We have measurements. I don't have the data for the state House and the state Senate from the 2011 redistricting, but we know about the state congressional delegation. We know about the country as a whole. In terms of the degree of partisan bias nationwide, after 2010, 2011, 2012 redistricting cycle, there was a major shift, which has not really been seen and is really only explainable by conscious intent to do partisan gerrymandering on a nationwide scale, which resulted in something like 24 extra U.S. House seats being in the hands of the GOP for this decade, assuming normal elections, without a wave election, as Mr. Lee pointed out. That is a danger of this. And we can pretty easily map out different states in terms of how do they look. And the really gerrymandered states are the ones that have already been mentioned, like North Carolina, Virginia, Pennsylvania, and a few others like that, where you've got 3 or 4 seats more going to one political party relative to what the popular vote for all the U.S. House elections in that state were. There are a few Democratic states that are highly gerrymandered. Maryland is one obvious example. There's probably 2 extra U.S. House seats that are held by Democrats that shouldn't be if there was proportionality between the votes cast and the seats won. Louisiana is very complex, like always, in part because we lost a seat and we had that musical chairs game, in part because we've got this one majority-minority U.S. House seat. And it depends on which election you choose. In 2012, which is some of the data I have, Louisiana was the number 6 out of the top 10. Typical Louisiana, we're in the top 10 of the bad stuff. Not number 1 though, in terms of the most partisan gerrymandered in terms of the partisan bias. So we're 6 out of 10. If you go to 2016, in which Barack Hussein Obama was not on the ballot, and there was a lot less voter turnout on the Democratic side, Louisiana looks not nearly as partisan gerrymandered. But it is cooked into a high turnout for black Democratic voters election. We are, in fact, one of the most gerrymandered states, along with Mississippi and Alabama and other states in the Deep South. And it isn't just because of majority-minority districts. Some people blame that and say, well, it's because y'all have the VRA, so you gotta have this. To some extent, it's a zero-sum game. You can't maximize majority-minority districts and maximize partisan competitiveness. But California, New York, Illinois, Florida, other states have lots of majority-minority districts, and they're also fairly competitive, fairly responsive, with a very low amount of partisan bias. Last point is, these different forms of districting, there are statistically valid, consistent outcomes. The worst outcomes you get in terms of partisan responsiveness and so forth are having one party run everything through the legislature. You do a little bit better, you get bipartisan incumbency protection when there's divided government. Actually, federal judges do really well. If we could just let federal judges decide everything, we'd get fairly competitive, fairly unpartisan districts. And the partisan and bipartisan and nonpartisan commissions, not to split hairs between them, they tend to do really well. If you want to see a beautiful map, look at this California U.S. House map. It's right down the line. It's very, very fair from these kind of social science criteria.
Thank you. All right, we have a few minutes for a couple of questions, and we will be happy to pass the mic so everybody can hear. There's a question in the back.
Do judicial elections or districts, are they included in these commissions, or is it just legislative?
They typically are not, because we don't do judicial redistricting at the same level, and in many states, for the high courts, they're elected at large. So.
Yeah. Most of these commissions apply at the congressional and state level. There may be some states that use some different formats down the line, but not as many.
If I can ask Michael, there's nothing in federal law that prevents a state from applying a very strict standard to judicial redistricting. It's just the federal courts are not going to make you do the same.
That's right. Yeah, they could, but it hasn't been required yet.
Yes, I came in, we were talking about gerrymandering prisoners, and of course I had that bill last year, and the House didn't go anywhere. But are states really looking at the idea that that one man, one vote does apply to prisoners? Because we also have the issue in Louisiana where pretrial inmates who are supposed to be able to vote are not even given the opportunity to vote.
So is the question about whether states are talking about excluding prisoners from the count altogether? Is that, that is something that people have sometimes talked about. It's not a high salience issue in most states. The bigger push has been on trying to get states to count prisoners where they used to be from. In New York, where I live now, something like 80% of prisoners who are mostly housed in upstate New York come from New York City or the surrounding areas, and which makes it sound really horrible in some ways, but that's where the people get originally come from, but they also go back because like nobody goes to Utica, New York, and for prison and says, you know, I guess I'm going to stay here afterwards. It seems like such a nice area, and so you know, there is a big push to get. And the Census Bureau is actually helpful. They're helping to reallocate people where they are. It's just an administrative issue for many prisons who, you know, they track prisoners for many reasons, but one of the things that they don't actually have to track in keeping somebody incarcerated is where they originally came from. So they, in many cases, like I'm told at Angola, they actually had all the prisoner addresses on paper files and file cabinets, and so it wasn't as easy as pushing, you know, a report and generating it. So that's probably the bigger push. But there is a lot of concern that people are going to try to exclude, to move to what it's called an eligible voter, redistricting based on eligible voters. So that would exclude children, it would exclude non-citizens, it would exclude prisoners and other people who can't vote. And that is a big push that is being done by Ed Flum, who brought some of the affirmative action cases and others. We'll see where that gets. It hasn't gotten a lot of traction yet, but he just wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal this week that made another call that we should do that.
Very briefly, this whole question is a kind of parallel to the broader redistricting and gerrymandering argument, and not again to get into the broader question of felon disenfranchisement and the right to vote and voter ID and all that. It's out there, and different states are pursuing different things. It's one of these areas where the state has wiggle room, to use a technical term. But to be very serious about this, both the right and the left have a position on this. Dare I say his name, former Senator David Vitter, when he was in the Senate, tried to pass legislation through the Congress to exclude non-citizens from the federal census count to apportioning among the states, because he didn't want those people to count, because that will help the Republican Party. And I don't know if there's any racial animus behind that, but he has a partisan interest in doing so. If you count everybody, especially if you count prisoners where they come from and not where they're in prison, that is going to help the Democratic Party. There is whether or not you're a racist or an anti-racist or whatever is deep in your heart, it's got partisan consequences, and they're real consequences. And I'll say one brief thing is, remember the 15th Amendment. If you read the whole 15th Amendment, it says the states that don't let people vote on the basis of race were going to be, it was never activated. The Congress could strip away those House of Representatives and those Electoral College votes from those states. It was never acted upon. It was in the Constitution. So when we say we got to count everybody, that's the left Democratic anti-racist position. If you're not going to let people vote and you're going to use their body and their existence against them, there is a kind of anti-racist position of saying that those people shouldn't count, because prison gerrymandering is a little too close to the 3/5 compromise for my satisfaction, if you remember what that was.
We are about out of time. One last question.
You've all talked a lot about partisan gerrymandering, but one of the things that I hear a lot in Louisiana is gerrymandering kind of, I guess, to protect incumbents. The previous panel discussed it in the context of Jeff Landry's district was collapsed. If it had been Billy Tozan, it probably would not have been. I've heard people on both sides say, in the state legislature, say that during the last round they were asked, how do you want your district to look to be reelected? I was just hoping you could speak a little bit to that type of gerrymandering.
Well, I would say that's the most common type of gerrymandering you see, especially in states where the legislature still controls it, and it probably gets the least attention. But without a doubt, I mean, there have been, some states will handle this in different ways. Most of the time, the states will let their legislators have some input on what they want their district to look like. And you could say, well, that's bad, it's incumbent gerrymandering, but that could be about trying to provide the best representation, if you want to put a positive spin on it, in terms of, who people, how the lines are drawn up and who's being represented by whom. In some states, they'll do it where they let the majority party draw their lines first, and then go to the minority party and say, fill in your lines however you want. And that's often a compromise that you often see in states with sort of divided government, as it's just, let's just protect ourselves and go on. That may limit competition in future electoral cycles. But yeah, the incumbent gerrymandering is, like I said, it is probably the most common form in this process. And usually gets, but it's not as sort of sexy, it doesn't get as much attention in the media usually.
And it's probably not going to come up, it is not the subject right now of any of the legal challenges, and it
Exactly.
may not come up just because it's sort of hard to constitutionalize why that's a harm, but it can be taken care of in other types of redistricting reforms.
Nationwide, the trend has been against incumbency protection and more for aggressive partisan winner-take-all. My tribe will outnumber your tribe, not protect individuals. If you do look at the state legislature, look at Bodie White's district. It looks weird. Look at John Hilario's district. It's weird looking. If you know, in 2011, it's in the northwest part of Louisiana, there was a majority African American, majority minority district that was like 88% black, and the incumbent didn't want to dial that number down very much. So it's not just leadership and so forth. Sometimes it is this issue, but that's circumstantial. I can't prove that much about this thing.
One last thought.
Yeah, just let me say this last thing on that point. Some states make it, they've tried to make it where you can't consider where incumbents live in the process. Florida has done that with some constitutional amendments that went into place this last time, and that led to more core challenges. And did they really not consider this, the residency? So there are ways that states have tried to deal with this, but it's not through the courts usually.
Thank you all. I'd like to thank our panel, Michael Lee, Dr. Brian Marks, and Dr. Jonathan Winburn. Thank you all, and I think we're going to break for lunch. I'll let Marie come and give us our next instructions.